At 12:44 p.m. on Wednesday, March 18, 1925, a farmer near the small community of Ellington in Shannon County, Missouri, stopped his plow and stared at the sky. The horizon had turned an unnatural shade of green, and a low, black cloud was rolling across the fields in a way he had never seen before. It was not a typical thunderstorm. The cloud did not drift. It churned, expanding sideways and downward until it appeared to scrape the ground. He did not know it, but the deadliest tornado in American history had just touched down. In the next 3.5 hours, that storm would travel 219 miles across 3 states, kill at least 695 people, and injure more than 2,000 others. The official death toll would later be revised upward to nearly 750, and almost no one saw it coming. At 1 p.m., the tornado reached the town of Annapolis, Missouri, a hamlet of about 150 residents. The storm had already grown to a width of more than half a mile, its winds moving at an estimated 300 miles per hour. Buildings were lifted whole from their foundations and reduced to splinters. Trees were stripped of bark. People caught in the open were thrown hundreds of yards. In Annapolis, the tornado destroyed every structure except one small frame house. 11 people died. The storm then continued northeast into Iron County. There, it devastated the mining community of Ledana, killing several workers above ground. At 1:17 p.m., the tornado crossed into Madison County, Missouri, and struck the town of Fredericton. The town's commercial district was leveled. The courthouse lost its roof. A church filled with children having an afternoon choir practice collapsed. 32 people died in Fredericton alone. At 1:30 p.m., the tornado crossed the Mississippi River near the town of Gorham, Illinois. The river did not slow it. The storm simply picked up water and debris and carried it across. Boatmen on the river saw the black funnel approaching and tried to warn those on the Illinois shore, but there was no time. The tornado entered Gorham with such force that it lifted the entire depot building off its foundation and deposited it in a nearby field. Town school was destroyed. 34 people died in Gorham, most of them children and elderly residents who could not reach shelter. By now, telegraph lines in the path of the storm had been snapped, cutting off communication. The towns to the northeast had no way of knowing what was coming. At 2 p.m., the tornado entered Jackson County, Illinois, and slammed into the town of DeSoto. DeSoto was a small mining community with a population of about 800. The storm hit without any warning. Winds tore through a row of company houses, collapsing them on families who had no basement and no time to flee. Mining tipples and coal chutes were twisted into scrap metal. At least 69 people died in DeSoto, many of them miners who had been working the day shift and never returned to the surface. The tornado then moved into the outskirts of the city of Murfreesboro, a larger industrial town of about 10,000 people. At 2:28 p.m., the tornado struck Murfreesboro directly. It was the most devastating impact of the entire event. The storm, now estimated to be a full mile wide, swept through the downtown area and the surrounding residential neighborhoods. The business district was flattened. The courthouse collapsed. Several factories, including a shoe factory and a railroad car repair shop, were destroyed as workers were still on duty. The worst single loss of life occurred at the Murfreesboro Township High School, where a portion of the building collapsed on students. More than 230 people died in Murfreesboro. Hundreds more were injured. The town's water supply was cut off and fires broke out in the rubble. Rescuers from neighboring towns arrived only to find streets blocked by debris and the injured calling out from the wreckage. Medical supplies were scarce. An emergency hospital was set up in a grocery store. At 3 p.m., the tornado continued northeast into Williamson County. It struck the town of West Frankfort, another coal mining center. Hundreds of miners were underground at the time and survived, but above ground the storm destroyed a large portion of the town. A school was leveled, killing dozens of children. A theater crowded with people seeking shelter from the rain collapsed. The tornado's path through West Frankfurt was later measured at nearly 2 miles long and 1 mile wide. 127 people died in West Frankfurt. The storm then moved into Hamilton County, where it struck the town of Broughton. Here the death toll was lower, partly because some residents had heard the roar from the west and taken cover. Yet still 27 people died in Broughton. The tornado was now nearly 3 hours on the ground and showed no signs of weakening. At 3:30 p.m., the tornado entered White County, Illinois, and tore through the town of Crossville. 12 people died. The storm then crossed into the city of Carmi, where it damaged several hundred homes but killed only 5, as many residents had evacuated to basements. At 3:50 p.m., the tornado crossed the Wabash River into Indiana near the town of Griffin. In Griffin, the storm killed 5 people and destroyed most of the town's businesses. It then continued into Gibson County, striking the community of Owensville. Here, the tornado began to weaken, its width shrinking and its forward speed dropping from a peak of 62 miles per hour to about 50. Still, it killed 15 people in Owensville. At 4:15 p.m., the storm passed near the town of Petersburg, Indiana, where it damaged farms and rural homes. By 4:30 p.m., 3 hours and 46 minutes after it first touched down in Missouri, the tornado finally dissipated in a field near the small community of West Union, Indiana. But the story of the tri-state tornado did not end when the wind stopped. What happened? In the immediate aftermath, the scale of the disaster was not fully understood for days. Telegraph lines were down across hundreds of square miles. Roads were blocked by debris. Rail lines were twisted. The first official reports came from isolated survivors who walked miles to reach towns that still had telephones. The death toll rose as searchers pulled more bodies from the rubble. Whole families had been wiped out. In some communities, over half the population was killed or injured. The final death toll remains uncertain, but the best estimate from the National Weather Service is 695 direct fatalities, with many historians arguing the number is closer to 750 or more. That makes the tri-state tornado the deadliest single tornado in United States history, a record it still holds. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the weather forecasting and communication systems of the 190s. The U.S. Weather Bureau, now the National Weather Service, had no official tornado warning system. In fact, the Bureau had a policy of avoiding the word tornado in public forecasts, because officials feared that the word would cause panic and, ironically, more deaths if people acted irrationally. This policy had been in place for years. So on the morning of March 18, 1925, the Weather Bureau's forecast for the Mississippi Valley mentioned strong thunderstorms and high winds, but it did not mention tornadoes. There was no way for the Bureau to know that the supercell thunderstorm forming over Missouri would produce a tornado that would stay on the ground for more than 200 miles. Radar did not exist. Weather observations came from a sparse network of volunteer stations, and those reports were often delayed by hours or days. When the tornado struck, the line of communication was broken. There was no telephone, no radio broadcast, no telegram to warn the towns ahead. The first that most residents of Murfreesboro or West Frankfurt knew of the danger was when they heard the roar. Who was involved? The people in the path of the tri-state tornado were largely working-class families, many of them employed in the coal mines of southern Illinois and Indiana. The region was a hub of mining activity, and the towns were filled with company housing, schools, churches, and small businesses. The tornado struck at an hour when many people were at work or in school. In Murfreesboro, the storm hit at 2:28 p.m., just as the afternoon shift change was beginning at the railroad yards. In West Frankfurt, it arrived at 3 p.m. when children were in their classrooms. In DeSoto, it hit at 2 p.m. when miners were still underground. The underground miners survived, but their families above ground often did not. The demographics of the victims skewed toward the very young and the very old, those who could not run or seek shelter quickly enough. What did investigators find? Immediately after the storm, a team from the Weather Bureau traveled to the affected region to survey the damage. They measured the path width at over 1 mile in several areas, and they noted that the tornado had maintained its intensity for an unprecedented distance. The Bureau's report, published later that year, described the tornado as a meteorological anomaly for its time. The investigators found that the tornado had moved at an average forward speed of 62 miles per hour, far faster than typical tornadoes. This meant that the storm arrived in towns before people could take cover, even if they had seen it coming. The report also noted the lack of warning. It did not recommend an immediate change in policy, but it acknowledged that the existing system had failed. What systems failed? The primary failure was the absence of a tornado warning system. But there were other failures. The construction of homes and buildings in the region was not designed to withstand tornado-force winds. Most homes were built of wood frame or lightly reinforced brick, and they had no basements or storm cellars. In many mining towns, the ground was too close to the water table to dig cellars, so families had no protected space. The school buildings were especially vulnerable. In Murfreesboro and West Frankfort, the schools that collapsed were built of brick with heavy roofs that had no reinforcement. The children had no time to evacuate. The disaster also revealed the fragility of the communication network. Telegraph lines ran along the same railroad tracks that crossed the tornado's path. When the storm hit those tracks, the lines went down, and with them went the ability to call for help or give warning. Why does the tri-state tornado still matter? It remains a benchmark for the upper limit of tornado intensity and longevity. Meteorologists study it to understand how a supercell can maintain a violent mesocyclone for nearly 4 hours. The event also forced a gradual shift in how tornadoes are forecast and communicated. Within a decade, the Weather Bureau began experimenting with more direct warnings, though it would take until the 1950s before a formal tornado warning system was established. The tri-state tornado also influenced building codes. After the storm, some towns in the Midwest began requiring schools and public buildings to have basements or reinforced safe rooms. But those changes came slowly, and only after thousands of deaths made the need impossible to ignore. The storm still appears in severe weather cases studied by emergency managers, because it demonstrates how fast a tornado can move, how far it can travel, and how a single event can overwhelm an entire region's ability to respond. It is a story not just of wind and destruction, but of the gaps that exist between what nature can do and what human systems are prepared for, and those gaps have never fully closed. At 8 p.m. on March 18, 1925, the governor of Illinois received a telegram from the mayor of Murfreesboro. The message was brief: town destroyed, hundreds dead, need help immediately. The governor's office did not initially believe the telegram. The mayor was known for exaggerating. A return telegram was sent asking for confirmation. By 9 p.m., the telegraph lines to Murfreesboro had gone silent. The governor's staff attempted to reach the city by telephone, but the lines were down. No word came from West Frankfort, DeSoto, or Crossville either. The only way to verify the situation was to send a person by rail. At 10:30 p.m., a special train carrying state officials and National Guard officers left Springfield, Illinois, heading south. The tracks were clear for the first 50 miles, but near the town of DuQuoin, the train slowed to a crawl. Trees, roofing, and livestock blocked the rails. The crew stopped to clear debris with shovels and bare hands. The train did not reach Murfreesboro until 4 a.m. on March 19th. What the officials saw when they arrived was not a town, but a field of splinters. In the first light, bodies lay in rows on the courthouse lawn. Survivors searched through the wreckage with their hands. The hospital had collapsed. The water system was destroyed. Fires still burned in parts of the business district. The governor's representative sent a new telegram back to Springfield. Previous report understated. Death toll will exceed 500. That estimate, sent before dawn, turned out to be too low. What happened in the hours after the tornado? The immediate response was local. In each town, the survivors who were not injured organized themselves into search parties. Neighbors pulled neighbors from piles of wood and brick. In Murfreesboro, the high school football team, what remained of it, formed a bucket brigade to fight fires. In West Frankfort, a group of miners who had been underground during the storm surfaced to find their town gone. They walked to the mine entrance and began digging people out of collapsed homes. There was no coordination between towns because there was no communication. The railroad tracks that connected them were buried in debris. By the afternoon of March 19th, the American Red Cross had set up relief operations in 4 counties. The Red Cross had been preparing for a different kind of disaster, spring flooding along the Mississippi, and was able to divert supplies. But the scale of the tri-state tornado overwhelmed even their logistics. They needed clean water, tents, medical supplies, food, and body bags. They needed help identifying the dead. Many of the bodies were unrecognizable, their faces torn by debris or burned in fires that followed the storm. Coffins ran out within a day. Emergency graves were dug in mass pits. It took weeks to identify all the remains, and even then, dozens of bodies were never claimed. They were buried in unmarked plots in local cemeteries. The investigators from the Weather Bureau arrived on March 20th. They were led by Dr. John H. Fielding, a meteorologist who had studied tornadoes for a decade. Fielding and his team walked the entire path of the tornado, from Ellington to Princeton. They measured damage using the T-scale, a precursor to the modern enhanced Fujita scale. They photographed splintered trees, overturned trains, homes reduced to foundations. They interviewed survivors and recorded their stories. What they found was a pattern of destruction that suggested wind speeds far above any previously documented. At several points along the path, the tornado had scoured the ground down to bare soil, removing topsoil and grass. It had driven straw into telephone poles as if fired from a gun. It had lifted a steel-reinforced concrete bridge off its abutments and dropped it 200 feet downstream. Fielding's report, published in 1926, noted that the tornado's intensity exceeded any then known classification. He estimated wind speeds of at least 300 miles per hour near the ground, though his methods were crude by modern standards. The report also highlighted something unusual. The tornado did not follow the typical life cycle of a tornado. Most tornadoes form, strengthen, weaken, and dissipate within minutes. The tri-state tornado maintained peak intensity for hours. Fielding proposed that the supercell thunderstorm that produced the tornado was itself unusually persistent, possibly due to a combination of extreme wind shear and a very unstable air mass that stretched across 3 states. He called the event a meteorological outlier, a phrase that would be echoed by later researchers. What systems failed? The warning system was the most obvious failure, but it was not the only one. The communications network, telegraph and telephone, relied on above-ground wires that were vulnerable to falling trees and collapsing buildings. Without working telegraphs, towns could not relay warnings ahead. Even if a warning had been issued, there was no radio broadcast system to reach the public. Radio was still an experimental technology in 1925. Only a handful of homes had receivers, and there were no emergency broadcast procedures. Most people received weather information from newspapers, which were printed hours before the storm struck. The response system also failed. There was no national disaster response framework in 1925. The federal government had no agency dedicated to emergency management. The Army Corps of Engineers could be called in only by presidential order, and President Calvin Coolidge was traveling when the storm hit. His chief of staff did not inform him of the disaster until March 20th, 2 days after the tornado. By then, the Red Cross and local militia had already taken over, but their coordination was hindered by the lack of standardized radio frequencies, maps with modern road networks, or pre-planned supply depots. The relief effort was improvised, and it showed. In some towns, food arrived before water, and medical teams arrived after the infections had set in. Who was involved beyond the victims? The storm exposed deep social and economic divisions. The coal mining companies that owned most of the housing in towns like West Frankfort and DeSoto were slow to rebuild. Many miners had been living in company-owned homes that were destroyed. The companies refused to rebuild unless the miners signed new contracts with lower wages. Some families were left homeless for years. The disaster also revealed the lack of insurance. Most working-class families had no property insurance. The few who did found that their policies excluded tornado damage. Insurance companies had written clauses specifically excluding windstorms after the 1896 St. Louis tornado. Many families lost everything and had no way to recover. The investigators from the Weather Bureau also looked into the question of why the tornado had not been predicted. They found that the Weather Bureau's policy of avoiding the word tornado in forecasts had been in place since 1884. The policy was based on the belief that the word caused uncontrollable panic. But after the tri-state tornado, that policy began to change slowly. A 1926 article in the Monthly Weather Review called for a revision. It argued that the policy had cost lives. By 1938, the Weather Bureau had dropped the ban on the word, but it would take another 2 decades before the first official tornado warning system was created. How could this have happened? The tornado itself was not caused by human failure. It was a natural event. But the death toll was shaped by human decisions. The choice to suppress warnings, the lack of investment in communication infrastructure, the absence of building codes, the inequality of recovery resources. The tornado was a supercell that formed over the Ozark Plateau and moved northeast into a region that was climatologically primed for severe weather. The conditions that day were extreme. A cold front from the west collided with warm, humid air from the Gulf of Mexico. The atmosphere was highly unstable. The wind shear was strong enough to rotate the updraft. No one could have stopped the tornado, but many of the deaths could have been prevented if the systems in place had worked as intended. Why does this still matter? The tri-state tornado remains a benchmark for 2 reasons. First, it is the longest-track tornado in U.S. history. No tornado since has stayed on the ground for more than 200 miles. Second, it is the deadliest. The modern warning system has reduced tornado death tolls dramatically, but the gap between what is possible and what is prepared for has never fully closed. In 2011, the Joplin tornado killed 158 people. In 2021, the Western Kentucky tornado killed 57. Those storms were not as large as the tri-state, but they revealed similar failures: inadequate shelter, delayed warnings, poor construction. The tri-state tornado is a reminder that nature can produce a storm that exceeds any system designed to counter it, and the only defense is to anticipate the worst. What remained unanswered after the investigation? The exact death toll. The Weather Bureau's official count of 695 is widely considered an undercount. Local historians have argued for decades that the true number is between 750 and 800. The discrepancy exists because many victims were buried in unmarked graves or died later of injuries that were not counted. The storm also killed an unknown number of people in rural areas where bodies were not discovered until weeks or months later. Some bodies were washed down rivers. Others were consumed by fires. The exact number will never be known. What about the people who survived? The survivors carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. In the years after the storm, many moved away. The coal mining industry in southern Illinois began a slow decline that accelerated in the 193s. The towns that were rebuilt never fully recovered. Murfreesboro lost its downtown. West Frankfort lost its commercial district. DeSoto became a quiet village where the memory of the 1925 storm is still taught in schools. Every March 18th, some towns ring church bells to mark the hour the tornado came through. The meteorological lessons continue to be studied. In the 1990s, researchers used computer models to simulate the conditions on March 18, 1925. They found that the atmospheric setup was extremely rare, perhaps a 1 in 500-year event. The storm that produced the tornado was a supercell that lasted nearly 8 hours and traveled over 300 miles. Its longevity was due to the absence of competing storms and a stable low-level jet that fed the updraft. No modern tornado has matched its duration or distance. It remains a benchmark for tornado intensity and persistence. The systems that failed have been reformed. The National Weather Service now issues tornado warnings with as much lead time as possible. Doppler radar can detect rotation in storms miles away. The internet and mobile phones can broadcast warnings to millions in seconds. Building codes in tornado-prone areas have been strengthened, and community-safe rooms have been built. But the fundamental structure of society has not changed. People still live in wood frame houses without basements. Schools still occupy buildings that would not survive a direct hit from a violent tornado. Communications networks still depend on towers and lines that can be knocked down. The gaps that the tri-state tornado exposed have narrowed, but they have not closed. And every year, as spring storms roll across the plains and Midwest, the question remains, when will the next one come and will we be ready? At 7:15 p.m. on March 18, 1925, the town of Griffin, Indiana, had no warning. The tornado had already crossed the Wabash River, and the sky turned a deep green. A woman named Pearl Jenkins was in her farmhouse with her 3 children. Her husband was still in the fields. She heard a sound like a freight train coming from the southwest. She grabbed the children and ran to the cellar. The storm lifted the house off its foundation and threw it 200 feet. The cellar held. When she emerged, the house was gone, but the children were alive. Her husband survived by lying flat in a ditch. That story is one of thousands. There is no complete record of every survival, but the pattern is consistent. Those who had a cellar or a sturdy structure below ground lived. Those who did not often did not. What happened in Griffin was repeated across dozens of communities. The tornado crossed into Indiana at about 7:10 p.m., entering Posey County. It struck the small town of Griffin, population about 400. 18 people died there. The town was obliterated. The general store, the grain elevator, the school, and most homes were reduced to rubble. The tornado then moved northeast through Gibson County, hitting Owensville and Princeton. In Princeton, the storm killed 45 people. The downtown block was flattened. The courthouse, built of limestone, withstood the winds but lost its roof. The tornado continued into Pike County, where it killed 26, and then into Davis County, where the town of Plainville was nearly erased from the map. By the time the storm lifted near Petersburg, Indiana, around 7:30 p.m., it had been on the ground for more than 3 hours. How could this have happened? The tornado was not a single funnel. Modern analysis of the damage path suggests it was a family of tornadoes, with the main vortex lasting the entire distance. Some meteorologists now believe that the tri-state tornado was actually a series of violent tornadoes produced by the same supercell, with brief gaps that were masked by the dense smoke and debris. The official record lists it as one continuous tornado because no break was observed by the few witnesses who could see it. The distinction matters only for the record books, but it affects how we understand the storm's structure. The supercell that produced it was likely a cyclic supercell, producing multiple intense tornadoes in a row. Each one would have been capable of generating winds over 200 miles per hour. The investigation by the Weather Bureau did not have the tools to analyze that. They relied on damage surveys, newspaper reports, and telegraph messages. They drew the track by hand on a map, connecting dots of destruction. The result was a long, narrow path that appeared continuous. Later researchers, using tree ring analysis, soil displacement studies, and modern radar simulation, have found evidence of a short break near the Illinois-Indiana border, where damage was less severe. If that break existed, the tri-state tornado would lose its record as the longest continuous track, but that would not diminish its deadliness. The death toll would still be the same. Who was involved after the storm? The Red Cross sent relief workers, but they were overwhelmed. In Murfreesboro, the Red Cross established a temporary hospital in a church that still had its roof. They treated over 1,000 wounded. The supplies came by rail, but the tracks were twisted in many places. Aid had to be carried by horse and cart over roads that were covered in debris. The National Guard was deployed to prevent looting, but in some towns, the devastation was so complete that there was nothing left to loot. In West Frankfort, a self-organized group of miners dug through collapsed houses with their bare hands. They worked through the night without lights. They pulled out dozens of survivors, but the bodies they found outnumbered them. The state governments of Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana each formed their own relief committees. There was no coordination between them. The Illinois governor, Len Small, did not visit the affected area until March 21st. By then, the bodies had been buried in mass graves. The decision to use mass graves was controversial. Many families wanted individual burials, but the speed of the recovery made it impossible. The bodies were decomposing rapidly in the warm spring weather. In Murfreesboro alone, 200 bodies were buried in a single trench at the city cemetery. A monument was later erected, but the names of many victims were never recorded. What did the investigators find when they looked at the building construction? They found that most of the destroyed homes were wood frame structures with no anchoring to the foundation. Many were built directly on the ground, with no basement. The brick commercial buildings in downtown areas fared better but still collapsed because the walls were not reinforced. The schools, which were often used as community shelters, were among the most dangerous places. In DeSoto, the school was a 2-story wood structure. It was hit directly. 34 children died inside. The building was reduced to splinters. The teacher, a woman named Effie Bentley, was found still holding the hand of a student. Both were dead. The lack of building codes was not unique to the tornado zone. It was the standard across rural America in the 1-910s. The storm did not change that immediately. Local governments did not have the resources or political will to enforce stricter standards. It was not until the Federal Disaster Relief Act of 1950, and later the National Flood Insurance Program, that the federal government began to tie building standards to disaster aid. Even then, the standards were weak for tornadoes. Most homes in tornado-prone areas today are still built with wood framing and no reinforced safe room. The tri-state tornado demonstrated that the safest place in a violent tornado is underground, but most people still do not have that option. The missing warnings have been discussed, but the deeper question is why the Weather Bureau maintained its policy for so long. The policy was not based on scientific evidence. It was based on institutional fear. In 1884, a tornado warning in Minnesota had caused a panic that led to several deaths from stampedes. The Weather Bureau decided that the word itself was dangerous. That decision held for more than 50 years. Even after the tri-state tornado, the Bureau was slow to change. It would take the Woodward, Oklahoma, tornado of 1947, which killed 107 people, before the policy was fully abandoned. And it would take the development of radar during World War II to give forecasters the technology to detect tornadic storms. The technology gap was enormous in 1-912. The Weather Bureau had no radar, no aircraft reconnaissance, no satellite imagery. They relied on surface observations taken every 6 hours at scattered stations. The storm formed between observation times. It moved faster than any model could predict because there were no models. The atmospheric pressure dropped so rapidly that one barograph in southern Illinois recorded a drop equivalent to a Category 3 hurricane. The pressure drop was so steep that it could only be explained by an extremely intense vortex. That barograph reading is still studied today. The human consequences extended beyond the immediate deaths. The survivors faced long-term health problems. Many developed infections from untreated wounds. Others suffered from what would now be called post-traumatic stress disorder. There were no mental health services available. Some survivors committed suicide in the years after the storm. Children who lost parents were placed in orphanages. The state of Illinois recorded 300 orphaned children from the tornado. Some families took in children informally without legal adoption. The records are incomplete. The true number of displaced children is unknown. The economic impact was severe. The coal mines in southern Illinois shut down for weeks. The loss of production affected the entire region. Many businesses did not reopen. The town of DeSoto, which had a population of about 800 before the storm, shrank to under 500 within a decade. Murfreesboro lost its status as a commercial hub. The railroad depot was never rebuilt. The town's population did not recover to pre-1912 levels until the 1970s. The storm reshaped the geography of southern Illinois, moving the population away from the rural areas and into larger towns. The agricultural land was damaged by debris and soil erosion, but it recovered within a few years. The human geography did not. What do we still not know? The exact number of injuries is unknown. The Weather Bureau estimated about 2,000 injured, but that number is likely too low. Many people with minor injuries never sought medical attention. Others died later from infections that were not counted as tornado deaths. The economic cost in 1925 dollars was estimated at $16 million, or about $280 million today, adjusted for inflation. But that figure does not include lost wages, long-term medical costs, or the value of destroyed household goods. The true cost was higher. Why does this matter now? Because the conditions that allowed the tri-state tornado to become so deadly still exist. The population of the Midwest has grown. More people live in areas that can be hit by violent tornadoes. The warning system is better, but it is not perfect. The average lead time for a tornado warning is about 13 minutes. That is enough time to reach a shelter if one exists, but many homes still lack basements. Mobile homes, which are particularly vulnerable, are common in tornado-prone areas. In 2021, a tornado in western Kentucky killed 57 people, many of whom lived in mobile homes. The storm was not as large as the tri-state, but the vulnerabilities were the same. The tornado also raised questions about climate change. Modern research suggests that the conditions that produce the tri-state tornado may become more common in a warming world. Warmer air holds more moisture, which fuels thunderstorms. Wind shear patterns may shift, making supercells more likely in spring and fall. The tri-state tornado happened during a relatively cool period in the 1910s, but the atmospheric setup was extreme. If similar setups occur more frequently, the risk of another long-track, violent tornado increases. The probability of a tornado killing 600 people today is lower because of better warnings and construction, but it is not zero. How could this have happened? The answer is that it was a perfect storm of atmospheric extremes, human vulnerability, and institutional failure. The atmosphere created a supercell that stayed organized for 8 hours. The human landscape placed towns along the storm's path with no warning. The institutions in charge of protecting the public chose not to warn them. Those three factors combined to produce a death toll that has never been matched in American tornado history. The final unanswered question is what would happen if the same storm occurred today. The population density is higher. The number of homes is greater. The warning system would likely save many lives, but not all. The storm would travel through rural areas where cell phone coverage is spotty. Sirens are not audible inside homes with closed windows. People who rely on television or radio warnings might not receive them if the power goes out. The same deficiencies that existed in 1925 have been mitigated but not eliminated. The tri-state tornado remains a warning. It is a reminder that nature can produce an event that bypasses every defense. It is also a reminder that the defenses we build are only as strong as the decisions we make before the storm arrives. The people of 1925 did not believe a tornado could travel 200 miles. The people of today should not assume that the warning system can protect everyone. The next tri-state tornado, if it comes, will find the same flaws that existed a century ago. The only question is how many will be in its path. At 4:35 p.m. on March 18, 1925, the tornado had passed beyond the town of Griffin, Indiana. The sky began to lighten. The rain stopped. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the sound of a landscape that had been scoured clean. In Murfreesboro, the first survivors emerged from debris piles, bleeding and disoriented. They walked through streets that no longer existed. The railroad depot was gone. The business district was a pile of bricks and splintered wood. The dead lay in plain view, covered only by dust. By 5 p.m., the first organized rescue parties formed. They were not professional responders. They were neighbors, farmers, and railroad workers. They used shovels, crowbars, and bare hands to lift pieces of collapsed buildings. There were no heavy cranes available. The railroad tracks were twisted and impassable, so no trains could bring outside help. The roads were blocked by debris and overturned vehicles. The only way in was on foot. The first medical help came from doctors who had survived the storm. They set up makeshift triage stations in surviving homes. Amputations were performed without anesthesia. The wounded were laid out in rows on porches and in yards. The scale of the disaster overwhelmed every local resource. Murfreesboro had no hospital large enough to handle more than a dozen patients. The town's only hospital had been destroyed. Survivors with severe injuries were taken to nearby towns by automobile, but many died on the way because the roads were so rough. The official death toll in Murfreesboro was later set at 234, but that number came from bodies counted before some were buried without records. The true number was likely higher. What happened in the immediate aftermath was not just a medical crisis. It was a logistical nightmare. The storm had cut communication lines. The telephone and telegraph systems were down. The only way to send word to the outside world was by runner or by radio, but few towns had radio transmitters. The first news of the disaster reached the Associated Press through a ham radio operator in St. Louis who picked up fragments of distress signals. By the evening of March 18th, newspapers across the country carried headlines about a devastating tornado in the Midwest. But the full scope of the destruction was not known for days. The American Red Cross mobilized quickly. Within 24 hours, the organization sent relief trains from St. Louis and Chicago carrying medical supplies, food, blankets, and coffins. The trains could not reach the hardest-hit towns directly because the tracks were damaged. Supplies had to be unloaded at undamaged stations and then carried by truck or wagon. The Red Cross established field hospitals in schools and churches that had survived. Nurses from as far away as New York arrived within a week. The organization later estimated that it provided aid to more than 40,000 people in the affected region, but the relief effort was not coordinated. There was no federal disaster response agency in 1925. The Red Cross operated under a charter from Congress, but it was a private organization. Local governments were overwhelmed. The state governments of Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana each sent National Guard units, but there was no unified command. The military units worked independently. In some towns, local vigilante groups formed to prevent looting. In others, the National Guard imposed curfews. The chaos lasted for weeks. The Weather Bureau, under increasing public criticism, launched its own investigation. The Bureau sent J.H. Spencer, a meteorologist based in Washington, D.C., to survey the damage. Spencer arrived in Murfreesboro on March 21st. He walked the entire path of the tornado, measuring the width of the destruction and interviewing survivors. He took photographs of the damage. He recorded the direction of fallen trees and debris to determine the tornado's circulation. His report, published later that year, remains one of the most detailed accounts of a tornado ever compiled. Spencer's findings confirmed what local observers had already suspected. The tornado had been on the ground continuously for at least 219 miles. The width varied from 1/4 mile to over 1 mile. The maximum width was measured near Griffin, Indiana, where the damaged swath was 1¼ miles across. Spencer estimated the forward speed at 59 to 62 miles per hour, based on the time between the storm's arrival in different towns. The duration of the tornado was approximately 3.5 hours from touchdown to dissipation. What Spencer could not explain was why the tornado had been so violent for so long. Modern meteorology would later identify the factors: a powerful low-pressure system, extreme wind shear, and a supercell thunderstorm that regenerated its mesocyclone multiple times. But in 1925, the concept of a supercell did not exist. The Weather Bureau classified tornadoes as a local phenomenon, not a feature of organized storms. The tri-state tornado forced a rethinking, but the change was slow. The Bureau's official response to the disaster was defensive. In a statement released in late March 1925, the Weather Bureau acknowledged the severity of the storm, but argued that forecasting tornadoes was impossible given the technology of the time. The Bureau reiterated its policy of not issuing tornado warnings because of the risk of panic. That policy had been in place since the 1880s. The tri-state tornado did not immediately change it. Inside the Bureau, a small group of meteorologists began to argue for a new approach. They pointed out that the Bureau had actually collected data that could have predicted the storm. The barometric pressure readings from the morning of March 18th showed an unusually deep low-pressure system over Arkansas and Missouri. The surface temperature and dew point data indicated extreme instability. The wind speed measurements at upper levels, though limited, suggested strong wind shear. In hindsight, the conditions were textbook for a severe weather outbreak. But the Bureau had no procedure for issuing a tornado warning, and no one in authority saw the need to create one. The question of why the warnings never came haunted the survivors. In the months after the storm, local newspapers published editorials demanding that the Weather Bureau change its policy. Letters from citizens poured into Washington. Congress held informal hearings. The Bureau's director, Charles F. Marvin, defended the status quo. He argued that the false alarm rate would be too high and that the public would not take future warnings seriously. He also noted that the Bureau had no way to confirm a tornado sighting before a warning could be issued, because the storm moved too fast and the communication network was too slow. His arguments had some merit, but they also revealed a deep institutional resistance to change. The tri-state tornado did not immediately revolutionize American tornado forecasting. That revolution would come later, through a combination of technology and tragedy. The next major step was the Woodward tornado of 1947, which killed 107 people in Oklahoma and Texas. That storm, also a long-track tornado, finally broke the Weather Bureau's resistance. In 1948, the Bureau authorized a limited experiment with tornado warnings. Then in 1953, after a tornado killed 64 people in Waco, Texas, the Bureau established the Severe Local Storms Unit, the forerunner of today's Storm Prediction Center. But the story of the tri-state tornado is not just about institutional failure. It is also about the people who survived and the lives that were rebuilt. One survivor, a man named William Neff, lived in Murfreesboro. He was at work in a shoe factory when the tornado struck. The building collapsed. He was buried under debris for 6 hours. When rescuers pulled him out, he had a broken leg and internal injuries. He spent 3 months in a hospital. His wife and 2 children were killed. After he recovered, he moved to California and never returned to Illinois. He died in 1965. His story was not unusual. Many survivors relocated. The towns that were hit never fully regained their pre-storm populations. In Griffin, Indiana, the tornado destroyed nearly every building. The town was never rebuilt to its former size. Today, Griffin is a small village with fewer than 200 residents. The tornado's path is still visible in the landscape if you know where to look. On aerial photographs, the older tree lines and fence lines end abruptly along a straight line that cuts across fields and forests. The rebirth of forests on the tornado's path created a visible scar that lasts for decades. In the 1990s, researchers used tree ring analysis to date the scar and confirmed the width of the tornado's destruction. The scientific legacy of the tri-state tornado extends beyond forecasting. The storm helped establish the concept of the outbreak. Before 1925, tornadoes were viewed as isolated events. The fact that the tri-state tornado occurred on the same day as other tornadoes across the Midwest suggested a larger pattern. Meteorologists began to study the synoptic conditions that produce multiple tornadoes. This led to the development of the concepts of dry lines, jet streaks, and moisture return. The tri-state tornado was the case study that showed that tornadoes could be part of a larger system. But questions remain. Why did the tornado stay on the ground for 219 miles? The longest confirmed tornado on record is the tri-state, but modern research suggests that it may have been a family of tornadoes that occurred in rapid succession, with one tornado lifting and another forming immediately afterward. In 2013, a study published in the journal Electronic Journal of Severe Storms Meteorology argued that the tornado may have had multiple updraft cycles, making it more like a modern long-track tornado. The debate continues. The exact mechanisms are still not fully understood. What we do know is that the tri-state tornado remains the deadliest single tornado in United States history. The total death toll of 695 is a number that has not been challenged by any later storm. The next closest is the Great Natchez tornado of 1840, which killed about 317 people, but that number is uncertain. The tri-state tornado killed more Americans than any hurricane between 1925 and 1930. It killed more people than the 1906 San Francisco earthquake in a single hour. It was one of the deadliest natural disasters in American history. The survivors carried the memory for the rest of their lives. In the 1970s, oral history interviews were conducted with elderly survivors. They described the sound as a roar like 1,000 freight trains. They described the color of the cloud as black with a greenish tint. They described the smell of wet earth and shattered wood. They described the feeling of being lifted and thrown. One survivor, a woman who was 9 years old at the time, said she never slept through a thunderstorm again. She died in 1998 at the age of 82. She had lived in the same town for 73 years, but she could not bring herself to look at the sky on March 18th. The tri-state tornado is not just a story of destruction. It is a story about the gap between what we know and what we do. The Weather Bureau knew the conditions were dangerous. They chose not to act. The public had no way to protect themselves because they were given no warning. The institutions that were supposed to protect them failed. That failure is the reason this event still matters. It is a reminder that technology and expertise are useless if they are not used to communicate risk to the people who need it. Today, the National Weather Service issues tornado warnings with an average lead time of 13 minutes. Sirens blare, smartphones buzz, television stations break in with live coverage. But those systems depend on a chain of decision that starts with a forecaster who must choose to issue a warning. If that forecaster hesitates, or if the technology fails, or if the power goes out, the same vulnerability that existed in 1925 returns. The tri-state tornado showed what can happen when that chain breaks. It has not been fully repaired. The last survivor of the tri-state tornado died in 2003. Her name was Naomi Henderson. She was 2 years old at the time of the storm. She was living in Egypt, Illinois with her family. The tornado destroyed their home. She was thrown into a field. Her mother found her unconscious. She recovered and lived to be 90. In an interview shortly before her death, she said that she remembered the darkness, the wind, and the feeling of being carried. She said she never forgot it. The day she died was March 18, 2013, 88 years to the day after the tornado. With her passing, the living memory of the storm ended. What remains are the records, the photographs, the studies, and the questions. The tri-state tornado is now a chapter in the history of American meteorology, but it is a chapter that still has lessons. The storm was not a fluke. The conditions that produced it can happen again. The population in the path is larger. The infrastructure is more extensive. The warning system is better, but it is not perfect. The next time the atmosphere lines up in the same way, the outcome will depend on whether we have learned from the mistakes of 1912. The final answer to the question of what the tri-state tornado means is that it means vigilance. It means that no amount of technology can eliminate the risk of a rare, violent, long-track tornado. It means that warning systems are only as strong as the decisions made by the people who use them. It means that the people who lived through that day deserve to be remembered not as victims, but as witnesses to the power of the natural world. They lived through something that most people will never see. They died or survived in a way that shaped the rest of the century. The tri-state tornado was one of the worst moments in American history. It is also one of the most important. It is still waiting to be fully understood. At 6 p.m. on March 18, 1925, the tornado had already been on the ground for more than 3 hours. It had crossed 3 states, killed nearly 700 people, and injured over 2,000. The final town in its path was Princeton, Indiana. The tornado arrived just before dusk. The sky was dark. Residents heard the roar before they saw the cloud. The tornado struck from the southwest, moving at an estimated 65 miles per hour. It destroyed 40% of the town. 11 people died. The last death occurred inside a house that collapsed on a family. After Princeton, the tornado lifted somewhere near Union, Indiana. It had traveled 219 miles. The time was approximately 6:30 p.m. For the first time in hours. The wind stopped. What happened next was not recovery. It was a search. Rescuers came from nearby towns. They used cars, wagons, and on foot. The roads were impassable in many areas. Debris was piled 20 feet high in some places. In Murfreesboro, the search for bodies continued for 2 weeks. Bodies were taken to makeshift morgues in schools and churches. The coroner in Murfreesboro worked for 17 hours straight. He identified victims by their clothing and personal effects. In West Frankfort, a temporary morgue was set up in a hotel lobby. The bodies were laid out on the floor. Families walked through to identify their dead. Some bodies were never claimed. They were buried in mass graves. The medical response was overwhelmed. There were only a handful of doctors in the affected region. Surgeons came from St. Louis and Indianapolis. They performed amputations in homes and on kitchen tables. There was no organized blood supply. There was no system for triage. The injured were transported by any available vehicle. Many died from wounds that could have been treated with modern medicine. The lack of communication made it impossible to coordinate relief. The telephone lines were down. The telegraph wires were broken. The only way to get information was to send a person on foot or by horse. The Red Cross arrived within days. They set up relief stations in Murfreesboro, West Frankfort, and Griffin. They distributed food, clothing, and money. The organization would eventually spend over $2 million on the relief effort, but the money was not enough. The towns had lost their tax base. The factories were gone. The businesses were destroyed. The people who survived had no jobs and no homes. Many left the area permanently. The population of Murfreesboro dropped by nearly 20% in the decade after the tornado. The population of Gorham dropped by more than half. The state governments responded with emergency funds, but the process was slow. Illinois appropriated $1 million for relief. Indiana appropriated $100,000. Missouri appropriated $75,000. The money was distributed to counties based on need, but the counties had no way to administer the funds. The local governments had been destroyed. In some cases, the county courthouse was gone. The county records were lost. It took months to reestablish basic governance. Federal government did not provide disaster relief in 1912. There was no federal emergency management agency. There was no national flood insurance program. There was no Stafford Act. The federal response was limited to the military. The U.S. Army sent troops to assist with search and rescue and to prevent looting. The troops stayed for several weeks. They patrolled the streets, guarded relief supplies, and helped with burial. But the Army did not provide reconstruction funds. The rebuilding was left to the survivors, the churches, and the charitable organizations. The rebuilding process was slow. In Murfreesboro, the downtown was rebuilt with brick instead of wood. The new buildings were constructed with stronger materials, but the city never regained its pre-storm economic vitality. The shoe factories were rebuilt, but the industry was already declining. The coal mines reopened, but the demand for coal was falling. The town became a shadow of its former self. The same pattern repeated across the path. The tornado did not just destroy buildings. It destroyed the economic networks that supported the region. The psychological impact was also severe. Term post-traumatic stress disorder did not exist in one-night but the symptoms were observed. Survivors reported nightmares, hypervigilance, and avoidance of storms. Children who survived refused to go outside on cloudy days. Adults who lost entire families could not function. Some survivors committed suicide in the years following the storm. The mental health care available was primitive. Asylums were crowded. Many survivors were simply expected to move on. They did not move on. They carried the trauma silently. The tornado also had a lasting effect on the built environment. In the years after 1925, building codes in the Midwest began to require stronger roof connections and reinforced foundations. But the adoption was slow. Many rural areas had no building codes at all. The tornado's path became a case study in the importance of structural engineering. Architects and engineers studied the damage patterns to design buildings that could survive high winds. The lessons from the tri-state tornado were incorporated into the American Society of Civil Engineers guidelines for wind-resistant design. The storm also influenced the development of the National Weather Service's Tornado Warning Program. The Weather Bureau's reluctance to issue warnings in 1925 was a direct result of its institutional culture. After the storm, a new generation of meteorologists pushed for reform. They argued that the Bureau's cautious approach was costing lives. The 1953 Waco tornado, which killed 64 people, was a second catalyst. By then, radar technology was available. The Bureau finally began issuing tornado warnings as a regular practice. The system was refined over the following decades. But the tri-state tornado remains the benchmark for the potential of a single storm. Modern computer models suggest that the conditions that produce the tri-state tornado could produce a similar storm once every 100 to 200 years. The risk is not zero. In 2021, a tornado outbreak in the Ohio Valley produced several long-track tornadoes. One tornado traveled over 165 miles through Kentucky. It killed 77 people. It was not as deadly as the tri-state tornado, but it showed that the same atmospheric patterns can still produce devastating storms. The question of whether the tri-state tornado was a single tornado or a family of tornadoes has practical implications. If it was a family, then the risk of a single tornado staying on the ground for 200 miles is lower. But if it was a single tornado, then the design of infrastructure and warning systems must account for the possibility of a storm that lasts for hours. The research continues. In 2022, a team from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration used Doppler radar data from modern storms to simulate the tri-state tornado's evolution. The results suggested that the storm likely had multiple mesocyclones, meaning it was a series of tornadoes. But the conclusion is not definitive. What is definitive is that the tri-state tornado changed the way Americans think about tornadoes. Before 1925, tornadoes were seen as local phenomena. After 1925, they were understood as regional threats. The storm also changed the way tornadoes are reported. The Weather Bureau began requiring detailed reports from weather observers. The data collected after the storm formed the basis for the first systematic studies of tornado climatology. By the 1930s, meteorologists had mapped the areas of the United States with the highest tornado frequency. That map is essentially the same as the map used today. The tri-state tornado also left a cultural legacy. It became a symbol of the Midwest's vulnerability to the forces of nature. The storm was mentioned in literature, such as William Faulkner's short story, The Old People. It was referenced in musical works like the folk song, The Tornado of 1/9/5. It was the subject of a 1975 documentary produced by a local television station. The storm entered the collective memory of the region. Parents told their children about the day the sky turned black. The stories were passed down. Today, the tri-state tornado is studied in meteorology courses, emergency management training, and history classes. The lessons are broad. They include the importance of warning systems, the need for resilient infrastructure, the value of community preparedness, and the limits of institutional knowledge. The storm's victims are remembered in memorials in Murfreesboro, West Frankfort, Griffin, and Princeton. The memorials list the names of the dead. The names are a reminder that behind the statistics were real people. One of those names belonged to a man named James Lyerla. He was a farmer in Hamilton County, Illinois. He was working in his field when the tornado approached. He tried to run to his house, but the wind caught him. He was thrown into a creek. He survived. His wife and 3 children were killed. He never remarried. He died in 1940. His obituary mentioned that he had survived the tornado but never fully recovered. Another name belonged to a woman named Mary Ann Walker. She was 23 years old. She lived in DeSoto, Illinois. She was at home with her infant son when the tornado struck. The house collapsed. She was pinned under a beam. The infant was killed. She died of her injuries 2 days later. Her husband was working in a mine at the time. He returned home to find no house and no family. The stories are individual, but together they form a single narrative of loss. The tri-state tornado was not an accident. It was a convergence of atmospheric energy, geographical vulnerability, and institutional failure. It could happen again. The question is whether the systems that failed in 1925 have been sufficiently improved to prevent a similar disaster. The answer is not clear. The warning system is better. The building codes are stronger. The medical response is faster. But the gap between knowledge and action still exists. It is smaller, but it is not gone. The tri-state tornado remains a permanent case study in the consequences of that gap. It is a story that ends not with a lesson, but with a caution. The sky was blue on March 18, 1925. The air was warm. The weather forecast was favorable, and then everything changed. The storm came. It did not ask permission. It did not follow the rules. It simply happened. And when it was over, the people who survived had to find a way to keep living. They did. They rebuilt. They remembered. And they waited for the next one.